Hi, Noor.
Hi, Shibli.
Martin, you're looking good. I hope that means you are doing well.
Yeah, I'm very well. You know, I put a tie on for the occasion. I told Khaled that
That's great.
it's the first time in 6 months that I've put a tie on.
Wow.
It's in honor of the cause.
I'm honored, although I could not reciprocate. Good morning, everyone. I'm Khaled El-Gindi, Senior Fellow and Director of the Program on Palestine and Israeli-Palestinian Affairs here at the Middle East Institute. I will be moderating this morning's discussion on looking at the Palestinians and U.S. elections, what's at stake. So just by way of context, I think it's pretty clear that for Israelis and Palestinians, as well as the rest of us, the differences between President Donald Trump and former Vice President Joe Biden really could not be more stark. The stakes are especially high for the Palestinians who watched as Trump has preempted virtually every issue that they care about, from Jerusalem and refugees to even the prospect of a viable and genuinely independent Palestinian state. Vice President Biden, on the other hand, has pledged to reverse many of Trump's policies, including things like cutting off aid, reopening the PLO mission, reopening the U.S. consulate in Jerusalem, and to salvaging what remains of a two-state solution and an attempt to restore U.S. Palestinian relations, which are now at an all-time low. All of this is happening against the backdrop of growing regional isolation for the Palestinians, as well as internal political division and institutional stagnation within the Palestinian polity. To shed light on today's topic, we have really an excellent panel of experts. I'll introduce them here briefly. You have longer bios are available on the MEI website page for this event. So just going in alphabetical order, first we have Martin Indyk, who is a distinguished fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York City. Martin was previously a distinguished fellow in the foreign policy program at the Brookings Institution, as well as executive vice president of Brookings, and also my former boss. He served as the U.S. Special Envoy for the Israeli-Palestinian negotiations in 2013 and 14, and has held a number of senior government posts, including as U.S. Ambassador to Israel. Next, we have Noor Odeh joining us from Ramallah. Noor is a media professional and journalist by training, specializing in public diplomacy, and is the founder of Connect, a strategic communications consultancy firm based in Ramallah. Noor has served as director of the Palestinian Media Center and spokesperson of the Palestinian government after having served as a senior communications advisor for the Palestinian leadership, and before that spent many years as a journalist for various Palestinian and international media, including Al Jazeera English. Finally, we have Shibli Talhami, who is the Anwar Sadat Professor for Peace and Development, Director of the University of Maryland's Critical Issues Poll, and a non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institution. Shibli is the author of numerous books, including The World Through Arab Eyes, Arab Public Opinion, and the Reshaping of the Middle East, and The Peace Puzzle, America's Quest for Arab-Israeli Peace, 1989 to 2011. He's also a world-renowned pollster who studied public opinion throughout the Middle East and in the United States. A few quick housekeeping items before we get started. I'll begin the discussion with a couple rounds of questions for each of our panelists, and then we'll take some questions from our audience. If you'd like to submit a question, please do so via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom window. Feel free to submit questions at any time throughout the panel. We'll be keeping an eye out on your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll do our best to integrate those into our discussion. Also, Please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be posted online immediately after the event is finished. Finally, if you have any technical problems, please let us know using the chat function, also located at the bottom of your Zoom window. Please don't use the chat to submit your Q&A, to submit your questions, as we may not see them there. So with that, I think we can go ahead and get started. Noor, I'd like to start with you as our one panelist who is in Palestine. As you know, Palestinian leaders across the political and ideological spectrum have pretty roundly condemned the various normalization deals between Israel and the UAE and Bahrain as a betrayal of the Palestinian cause and a shattering of the Arab consensus. What do you see, what has been really the Palestinian official response to these normalizations, given the challenge that they posed? And to the extent that you can comment on how effective what is the strategy and how effective is that strategy by the Palestinian leadership?
Well, I think the feeling of betrayal is across the board, whether it's in official circles or the public opinion. Palestinians felt very much betrayed, and that feeling has been vindicated, if you will, by subsequent events, by the announcements we're hearing about joint ventures between the UAE and Israel in particular on projects that would basically contribute to fund and entrench the occupation rather than assist in ending it, as would be expected from an Arab country. As far as the reaction or the strategy, the official strategy goes, I think the best thing that the Palestinian leadership could have done and started doing is to look inwards. Right now, it is very obvious that given the election fever in the United States, given the fears and the demons that Gulf states are battling about regional issues, we will see more of agreements like the one between the UAE, Bahrain, and Israel. And so looking inwards and getting the Palestinian house in order, I think, is the priority. The reaction is not going to change on subsequent agreements. They will be considered betrayal because that's what they are in Palestinian eyes. And there isn't much that can be done, I think, politically at this moment to stop this train, as we've seen now with Sudan and other discussions that are happening more quietly, perhaps. So looking inwards, the meeting of the Secretary Generals of the Palestinian factions inside the PLO and outside the PLO, the discussions between Fatah and Hamas have been very important. Personally, I hope that they can survive all the tension and all the pressure that is being applied to ensure their failure. But I think that's the best approach moving forward.
Thanks, Noor. Martin, I wanted to turn to you. You tweeted an article this morning about Avi Berkowitz, the White House envoy for Middle East negotiations, in which essentially the Trump administration is saying that normalization is still on the agenda.
Annexation.
Sorry?
Annexation.
Oh, yes, sorry, annexation. But it also sort of describes a threat that the administration sees to these normalization deals if Biden were to be elected. I'm wondering if you could address that, but also tell us why you think you've written elsewhere that these normalization deals are sort of a key to regional stabilization. Could you tell us how they stabilize the region and where the Palestinians fit into this picture of regional stability?
So the point that I've been trying to make in this regard is that if you look at what's happening in the region in a strategic context, particularly from an American point of view, the United States is retrenching. It's withdrawing its troops from the region, and that didn't start with Trump. He's just following an Obama policy in that regard, which is widely supported amongst the American public, that is tired of military entanglements in the Middle East that cost a huge amount of blood and treasure and really don't help the region and don't help us. So I think that is creating a certain vacuum in the region, which needs to be filled. We see Iran trying to fill it. We see Turkey trying to fill it. We see Russia trying to fill it. China is kind of playing on the edges, not really committed to an effort to take the place of the United States, but it won't take long before we see China in the game as well. And with all of those outside powers seeking to influence the situation, you get an exacerbation and destabilization of the situation. The UAE, Israeli, US axis is a way of, from an American perspective, of kind of filling in for America's retrenchment with two capable allies who share a concern about Iran's hegemonic ambitions and to some extent Turkey's as well. And so in that sense, it can serve a stabilizing function. Where do the Palestinians fit into this? Well, as you know, because you've written the book on it, essentially Palestinian value in the great game is a derived value from the fact that other more powerful states in the region have cared about the Palestinian issue, have put it oftentimes front and center in terms of their own approach to stabilizing the region. Your watchers will be familiar with the old line about how, the Palestinian issue is the core of the conflict. We have to solve that Palestinian issue if we're going to stabilize the situation. Well, that hasn't been the case for some time, but it's particularly not the case if the Arab states are no longer holding to the position that they articulated together, over 20 of them, in the Arab League Peace Initiative of 2002, which said that they would not make peace or normalize with Israel until there was a resolution of the Palestinian problem based on an independent state on the 67 lines with East Jerusalem as its capital. That is no longer the case today. And as a result of the UAE and Bahrain breaking with that commitment, and now Sudan, and it won't be long, as Noor says, before a number of others follow, with the Saudis being the big prize in all of this. But as a consequence, the strategic value of the Palestinian issue has declined. And we just have to face up to that reality. I think Noor's point about the need to look inward is well taken. There's a need for a reassessment of Palestinian strategy because the old one just went out the window. And so I think it's incumbent on the Palestinians, not for me to say what they should do. I have some ideas, but it's up to them, I think, at this point, to look reality in the face and not to waste their time on beating their chest about what a betrayal has been, and rather focus on how to recalibrate their strategies so as to promote their cause in a very different environment.
Thanks, Martin. Shibli, you've done obviously a lot of work in public opinion, both in the region and in the United States. And we're often told that it's not only simply that the leadership in the Arab world has shifted in its priorities, but also public opinion has shifted. Maybe deep in the direction of deprioritizing the Palestinian issue in parallel with the leadership. To what extent is that true? And to what do you attribute this this shift in the region?
Well, let me start by saying that at some level, I have been, for example, suggesting that the Palestinians haven't done enough to protect the Arab flank for a long time, long before these deals were made. That in a way, the Palestinian relations with other Arabs are anchors of the Palestinian strategy, because to the extent that the rest of the world think the Palestinian issue is very important or strategically important, that's predicated on the assumption that Arabs care about Palestine. It's not just the issue of Palestinians and Israelis, but Israelis and Arabs as well. And in some ways, the Palestinians haven't done enough in the Arab world, both in terms of their relations with Arab governments, to consolidate those and be in there as these Arab governments and making decisions on Palestine, and also reaching out to Arab public opinion, as it has been shifting indeed, particularly after the Arab uprisings. But having said that, let me just make 2 points that I think are central here to understand. Number one, even if the Palestinian Authority was the most brilliant strategist in the world and the Palestinians were united, I don't think we would be in a profoundly different place on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict than we are now. Because I think the reality of it is that the asymmetry of power is so decidedly favoring Israel that the Israelis have had a right-wing government for a decade that certainly does not advocate even the minimum acceptable to the Palestinians, and no one has been in a position to change that reality. So let's put that in perspective, even as there is some blame, obviously, for the Palestinians to take charge, and even if they do the best job moving forward, it's going to take a lot more than the Palestinians to move the needle. In the context of the Arab state, to go directly to your point about Arab public opinion, I think that it's a fluid environment. There's no question that at some level, since the Arab uprising, the Palestinian issue is not a priority also to the public in the Arab world. It's not just to governments. I mean, just look at how Arabs are so preoccupied with very difficult environments, whether it's in Syria or Libya or Yemen or Iraq or any one of the countries you want to pick. It's not something that is a priority issue as such. The question isn't that. The question is whether there's been a profound shift about caring for the Palestinians or more open to the Israelis. And that's really the question, is Arab public opinion now, open to making peace with Israel and with disregard to the Palestinian issue? Now, we've seen some polls. I haven't done polls recently on that. We've seen like the Arab American Institute poll, the Arab Center poll, with some contradictory results, actually. One saying really there's a very little shift, one saying there's a shift toward normalization, but tied to improvement in Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I personally do not at this time believe that there is any significant indication in Arab public opinion that suggests that there is a profound shift in Arab public attitudes toward Palestine. I don't see the evidence. It could be there, but I don't see it. Let me tell you why. Because I think we're looking at the wrong signals. Let's backtrack a little bit at the strategic picture that anchors this shift that we're assuming. The first is the Iraq War. Obviously, the Iraq War in 2003 has been devastating to the region in ways that we all understand, but it has made governments very insecure. It has made them very insecure, particularly in the Gulf, because, of course, it shifted the balance between Iran and Iraq in favor of Iran in a way that made them very insecure. And it generated this impact that Martin talked about of the U.S. wanting to get out of the region in a way that these countries can no longer rely on the U.S. in their defense as they had in the past. So they took things into their own hands. Even with the Iraq War, they felt extremely insecure. Then comes the Arab uprising. And then, very entrenched authoritarians are toppled, like, in Egypt, in Libya, and in Tunisia, and everyone feels a lot more insecure. So Arab rulers are very much 120% focused on their own survival, and they are become more interventionist to fill the vacuum of power that existed. And one of these missions that they had was to push opposition away from them across the board, whether it's the royals in the Gulf or Egypt and others. And the Palestinian issue in this regard is framed as an opposition issue that plays into the hand of the opposition against them, whether it's Islamist groups or leftist groups, or strategically in other countries like Turkey and Iran. So in some ways, these governments have had an interest in reducing the importance of the Palestinian question strategically because they saw it as a mobilizer of opposition to them. This is really a central point that we have to understand. The question is, have they succeeded? We don't know that for sure. Why? Because what we have seen as part of this strategy of coordinated strategy of these governments is that they have also repressed the press. So what we see in terms of when we quote the press in Egypt or or Arabia or any of it, we can't really get signals from that because we know that that is actually pitching what the governments want to pitch. And we also see the enormous, even online social media campaign to project or craft or create a paradigm related to that. We have no idea if this is working, and there are a lot of there's a lot of signals that it may not be working. So I don't think we should rush into judgment, number one. And number two, of course, the strategic picture could shift tomorrow. One big event can shift the strategic picture. So to pretend like that Palestine is no longer resonating in the Arab world in some ways is wrong. It's not a priority issue now. It's not for the governments, it's not for the public, but this is not an enduring trend. We have no evidence that's necessarily an enduring trend.
Thanks, Shibli. I want to stay with you for a minute, if we could, on the regional dimension of this whole issue. Clearly, as you laid out, and as we heard also from Martin and Noor, the Arab states are inclined to deprioritize this issue. Clearly, the Netanyahu government feels very much the same way, and the Trump administration is also trying to work from the outside in. They're trying to promote these regional normalizations in lieu of an Israeli-Palestinian deal or arrangement, which obviously this whole process is intended to marginalize the Palestinian issue. So my question to you is, since everybody's on board with this approach, can it actually work? I mean, everyone but the Palestinians, of course, but can this outside-in approach of regional normalization and sort of tightening the corner that Palestinians are squeezed in, can it actually work, especially given bipartisan support here in the United States?
Well, okay, let's think about a couple of things. Of course, at some level it could work. Sure, it has been working. But look at another level, okay? So, Egypt and Israel had a peace treaty since 1979. Every government of Egypt, except for Morsi's brief interlude, has supported and worked very closely, including the current government, with Israel, and saw even Israeli-Egyptian relations as somewhat strategic. Look at what we know about Egyptian public opinion. There is no obvious transformation. Even if you don't look at public opinion polls, look at how people who go to Israel or interact with Israel are demonized in Egypt today. It hasn't worked because there's some reservoir of support up to a point. So that's, of course, not, we don't know whether that's true in every Arab country, but if you look at, for example, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, Haim Saban, the Israeli Palestinian billionaire, who's very influential, had contacts with him yesterday, was quoted as saying that Mohammed bin Salman told him that he could not have normalized with Israel because, quote, his people would kill him, as well as Iran and Qatar. So at least his own assessment, if you were to believe this story, is that that's Mohammed bin Salman's assessment, that people care. So that's one thing that we have to keep in mind. I don't, no one is certain where that's going to be. The issue, though, is for what end is this so? For what end? So let's assume that, okay, it kills the two-state solution. Frankly, if I were to poll among, Middle East experts globally, I think you will find that a vast majority would say the two-state solutions have been long dead. That's not on the agenda. So what then is there going to be? So even Obama, after 8 years, who really meant, and obviously both Martin and I advised that administration in various ways, the needle wasn't moved. We didn't get there. So if you were talking about then, so Israel annexes, let's say Israel annexes the West Bank, that's just entrenching a reality that has been existent. It might actually remove the presupposition that looking for a two-state solution is still possible, and in a way put more, shed more light on the fact that Palestinians are not free. They're still under occupation. They're not equal. They're still suffering. They're still living under humiliation. And that's something that could generate further sympathy, not necessarily from rulers in the Arab world, but internationally and in the U.S.
Thanks, Shibli. Noor, I want to come back to you on a point that you made about Palestinians putting their own house in order. I think pretty much everyone here would agree that that is a priority. What does that look like in practical terms? Obviously, we've heard, there's the meeting in Istanbul with the Palestinian factions, yet another reconciliation deal, new calls for elections, and yet beyond those kind of photo opportunities and statements and sort of backslapping between Hamas and Fatah, we haven't really seen any progress towards actually holding elections, whether for the PA or the PLC or even the PNC is also on the agenda, the PLO's parliament in exile, essentially. So what, in your view, does putting the Palestinian house in order look like? And if you could also touch on this point that Shibli mentioned in terms of the absence of a Palestinian strategy, particularly on the Arab front. It seems to be kind of emblematic of a lack of strategy across the board. But it's especially felt, I think, at the diplomatic front, where Palestinians are more and more isolated. So if you could sort of paint that picture for us.
Okay. Well, let me just start by reminding those who are joining us for this webinar that we're talking about a regime where basically none of the governments are elected. So when you talk about Palestinian-Arab relations, these are relations that have a very peculiar dynamic, and usually Palestinian-Arab relations are conducted through the channels of security and intelligence. That's been how these relations are conducted. There has never been an illusion about where Arab governments are and what their priorities are. Sure, they've valued the Palestinian cause and they've put it front and center, many of them genuinely, many of them because you can't really, jump over the big elephant in the room that's been there since almost 100 years. Having said that, I'll go back to what Shibli said. I don't think that the regional dynamics, no matter what the Palestinian leadership could have done differently, would have yielded any different results. Relations with the public opinion in the Arab world are even more complicated, precisely because opposition is usually either in jail or in exile, and because at the official level it's very difficult to engage the public without upsetting those in power. The Arab on Arab relations between the publics has been happening in a very parallel universe, if you will. And that conversation is focused on rights, and that conversation is focused on the common aspiration for a reality that they deserve, that all these publics deserve, a reality of freedom, a reality of good governance, a reality of accountability, and very importantly, a reality of dignity, where their countries are not treated with such disdain by the powers that be. They're not pawns to serve the whoever is at the White House, and now whoever is in government in Tel Aviv. So what does Palestinian putting the Palestinian house in order look like? I think there are many ways this could go. I would warn that I think a lot of the dynamics right now are being affected by regional pressures. A lot of people are not interested in seeing Palestinian reconciliation. I do think that what happened in Turkey was significant. It was different from other rounds of talks that we've seen before. And so personally, I thought that this was quite encouraging. I think if we were to be serious, the discussion shouldn't be about PA elections. I think having reached where we are right now politically, given the circumstances that we're discussing, given the strategic damage that the Trump administration has done to the whole idea of peaceful resolution or negotiations or just civil relations, the Palestinians need to completely overhaul how they approach this and to refocus their energy on what matters: Palestinian unity, Palestinian self-determination, and being able to move this ball forward. I'm not talking about the day-to-day issues, and I'm not talking about domestic issues. I think these can be sorted out organically and internally. We have a very vibrant society, and despite all attempts to mute it or make it more docile, I think pretty much all Palestinian players know this is not a society you can govern by diktats. But politically speaking, I think the whole lingo and logic of the past 20-odd years needs to be discarded, quite frankly. And the only remnants of those past 20-some years would be the component of Palestinian strategy that, in my opinion, works and, in my opinion, has protected the Palestinian issue from dropping down the list of Arab priorities, which is the international dimension. The fact that this is not an issue detached from international law. Palestine is not an issue that you can look at and forget the fact that this is a cause, this is a question that was born at the United Nations. There's a volume, there's a body of works that has become part of customary international law on Palestinian rights, on Palestinian self-determination. I think the strategic mistake that was done is accepting the lingo of peace as if it were something happening in a parallel reality, detached from the foundation of justice and the rules that should be applied to all. And in that context, I think a reassessment, if Biden wins, would be important of past American administrations and how they've worked, and the fact that they talk about a two-state solution, but in the meantime, shield Israel from all accountability, shield Israel from all criticism, protect Israel from everything except itself, allow it to expand settlements, allow it to build the wall, allow it to commit war crimes, and in the end say, but we have to talk about it and we have to reach a two-state solution, even though annexation is happening every day, now at a far more accelerated rate, sure. But this has been happening. This has been happening since Netanyahu took office. So this is not breaking news for policymakers. And the writing was all over the wall. It was all over the wall from get-go with the Obama administration. And yet the approach didn't change. I think right now the Palestinians need to make sure that they say our approach to this will be different, and we will be taking a different track, whether you're on board or not. The fact that the Arabs are not on board, I think, in my opinion, is almost inconsequential. Because so long as Palestinians are here on the ground, so long as Palestinians continue to be committed to achieving their rights, their self-determination, Israel can't just wish us away. This is the only piece that counts as far as Israel is concerned. Sure, they can sign with the UAE a peace deal that ends no wars and that secures more and more arms sales. They can sign with Bahrain as well. They can even sign with Sudan and many other countries, maybe even Saudi Arabia. But that will not alter the dynamics of the conflict, the real conflict on the ground, of millions of Palestinians living under Israeli military control who do not want that military control, who want self-determination. That's not going to go away, even if past years of Palestinian performance wanted to jump over those details and talk about peace and talk in the accepted language. I think all of that needs to go out the window. And we need to realize that Palestinians in their collective, whether in the occupied territory or in the diaspora, need a different approach. And in that context, talking about two states or one state is not really the core issue. It's more about what Palestinians want, what they're willing to talk about, and what they're not.
I want to pick up that thread a little bit later on, but since you brought up the peace process, I think it's a good segue to my next question for Martin. Obviously, you've been around this issue for many years. You know Vice President Biden. You were part of the Obama administration, and as you know, we've seen, you know, the Biden team has already said in some detail what its policy on this issue would look like. They would reinstate aid to the Palestinians, including to UNRWA, the UN Refugee Assistance Organization. They would try to reopen the PLO embassy here in Washington. If Congress will let them do that, remains to be seen. They will reopen the U.S. consulate, and pretty much reversing everything that Trump has done, with the exception of moving the embassy back to Tel Aviv, the U.S. embassy from Jerusalem to Tel Aviv. Considering what the picture that Noor has painted and what we've seen, all of us really, these past many years, the peace process really wasn't doing all that well even before Trump. So what do you think a Biden administration would do differently, or not differently, when it you know, if and when it takes office? And is a return to essentially the status quo ante enough, in your view, to salvage a two-state solution at this stage, given the facts on the ground and the very rapid erosion that is happening even as we speak?
So the short answer to your second question is no, it will not be enough to forestall the process of de facto annexation, even though it will take formal annexation off the table, because Vice President Biden has made very clear that he opposes that annexation, and there's strong support within the party and the leadership for opposition to annexation. But the de facto annexation that has been going on for 3 decades now is likely to continue apace. And so a Biden administration will have to address the question of what to do about that. And I think that, first of all, let me say I don't speak for Vice President Biden or anybody associated with the campaign. I'm not in the campaign, so this is just my personal assessment. But I do think that policy will be driven by 2 key factors. One is the experience that we, and I include myself in this, had during the last years of the Obama administration, when Secretary of State Kerry and I, as his envoy, worked on the last final status negotiations there have been between Israel and the Palestinians way back in 2013, 2014. And that experience for the people that are now very close to Biden, who were very much involved in that at the time, was a pretty negative experience. I mean, I'd say totally negative experience. And we all came away with the conclusion that nothing can be done as long as there is not a change of leadership in Israel and on the Palestinian side. I'm not talking about regime changes of policy here. I'm just saying that because that effort, which was a high priority effort by the Secretary of State, it ended in failure. And because the circumstances have not changed, if anything, they've gotten worse and more difficult, I think that on the one side, Biden would think long and hard about taking an initiative here, appointing an envoy, trying to move the process forward in some dramatic way. Second factor, pushing against that, is the fact that within the Democratic Party, particularly amongst the progressives in the party who have become more influential, there is a strong support for the Palestinian cause and for a two-state solution, and wanting to see a democratic administration trying to do something about that. So how exactly the tension between those two pressures will play themselves out, we will have to see. But given the other priorities, and this is like Shibley's assessment of Arab government priorities, given the other priorities that a Biden administration will have, starting with the pandemic, and then the economy, and then China, and then climate change, it's very hard to imagine that this issue, the Palestinian issue, is going to be up there with those other priorities. And I think that is just a reality. But that does, in a way, allow some time for this process that Noor talks about of reevaluating, reassessing Palestinian strategy, for that to play itself out. And I think it's really important that as a new strategy is developed, that it not only address the issue of Palestinian unity, which is a critical issue, and Palestinian leadership, which is a second critical issue, but that's for the Palestinians. But it also needs to look at the relations with the Arab states, not just give up on them, but look at those that have already made peace, those that are now normalizing, and those that are likely to normalize, and start to engage in a dialogue with all of them about resurrecting a different approach, where the process of normalization itself becomes a lever on Israel to get things for the Palestinians, to relink normalization in a positive way for the Palestinians. And then, of course, there's the question of how to approach the United States. And a Biden administration that is committed to a two-state solution, that is opposed to annexation, I think would certainly be open to hearing how the Palestinians want to proceed and adjusting American strategy accordingly. So I think the ball is very much in the Palestinian court at this point.
Thanks, Martin. I'd like to stay with you for a minute and kind of look at the other scenario. Obviously, there's no guarantee that Biden will actually win. Trump could very well pull off a surprise and much as what happened 4 years ago, and he's reelected. At which point, what does that mean for the future of a two-state solution? Since we can expect to see really an acceleration of these facts on the ground, we can expect to see maybe even formal annexation happening. At that point, what does the picture look like under a second Trump term? And do you see value in the Palestinian leadership engaging with the Trump plan or with the Trump administration in the event that they have another 4 years?
Well, I think if they have another 4 years, that it is important as part of this process that I'm describing here of reassessment, that the Palestinians think about how they're going to deal with another 4 years of Trump. And there's a real danger that annexation will be formalized, that will be green-lighted, that this will put paid to Palestinians' hopes for a two-state solution. Therefore, before that happens, I do think that the Palestinians need to reestablish a dialogue with the Trump administration, if that's what they have to deal with. There have been no end of interlocutors who have been trying to reestablish the channel of communication, from Arab states to European states to individuals who are trying to use their influence. But I think that the critical thing, if I could suggest for the Palestinians, is number one, annexation cannot be part of any plan that a new Trump administration supports. Number two, that the plan that they've put out is not a fait accompli, is not an imposed solution, that everything in it is up for negotiation, and that there will be no unilateral acts by the Israelis that the Trump administration would endorse. And three, then to look at in a sense, to use a kind of boomerang approach. Since the Trump plan calls for two-state solution, calls for it on, let's say, roughly 70% of the West Bank, if all the other conditions are met that I said, is to engage and say, okay, we can't accept 70%, we need 100% with swaps. Let's talk about that, or let's talk about all of the elements in final status agreement. But as long as you say your plan is not something we have to accept, we're ready to talk about those principles, because those principles are part of the two-state solution. So I do think that as long as annexation and imposition is off the table, there could be a way to talk to the second Trump administration. And, as Churchill said, George War is better than World War. Not talking to them for another 4 years is only going to worsen the Palestinian condition.
Thanks, Martin. Shibli, I want to come back to you on the question of public opinion, but focusing on public and political opinion here in the United States. Sort of ironic that we've seen a shift, even as this shift has happened in the Arab world, where they're kind of downgrading the Palestinian issue, we see a very different trend here in the United States, where there are political constituencies who are getting more excited and more vocal about advocating for Palestinian rights. And Martin mentioned the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. Could you talk to us a little bit about the significance of that shift, if in fact there is one, in terms of that shift translating from public opinion to the political realm and even the policy realm, what impact it might have, either in a Biden administration or in a second Trump term?
Great. I will address that, but I just want to say a couple of things to frame it. So one thing is to agree with Martin on the priorities. I mean, certainly if Biden gets elected, this is not a top priority for any new administration, certainly not for a Biden administration. It's not likely to be for Democratic public opinion. Look, even the Supreme Court is sort of a central issue, obviously, to all Americans, but even that is sort of sidestepped by, it's about saving our democracy broadly. Is it for Trump, against Trump? Right after, I think that this is not going to be a top priority. But even if it's not a top priority, the sort of things that a Biden administration is likely to do right away, such as renewal of aid, opening the consulate in Jerusalem, possibly referring to international law and UN resolutions as a frame of reference, those are really important for the lives of the Palestinians and also for kind of generating a different environment. They're not going to move the needle broadly immediately, but don't underestimate their importance. They're important steps to carry. As for Trump getting reelected, and fortunately, as someone who studies public opinion polls and carries them out, I think that is really a very, very small chance at this point. I know we're all terrified by the 2016 experience, but there's so many differences from 2016 that I don't think this is likely at all. I have lingering fear myself, but I don't think that's likely. But if it is likely, I think the Israeli-Palestinian conflict will inevitably become not about two states, whether or not the PA plays in. I'm not sure the Palestinians should engage a second administration for the following reason. I mean, I see the pragmatic arguments of Martin advances, and I sympathize with them, and in some ways I go back and forth. But if you look at it from this administration knows exactly what it wants to do. I mean, the Palestinians did engage in the beginning. Did we forget that they actually engaged? In fact, Mahmoud Abbas and the Palestinian Authority were excited about Trump initially after the first meeting. There were people who were saying, it's going to happen. Mahmoud Abbas described him in flowering terms. And then obviously things shifted, and the Palestinian input didn't have any impact whatsoever on their decisions, because ultimately they knew what they were going to do, and they were going to do it with or without the Palestinians. And if the Palestinians are in, they'll just legitimize the process. I'm not sure it'll make a difference personally. I think it'll just increase the assessment there's no two states, and it'll focus the attention on reality on the ground. And that's where the public opinion shift that you talked about comes in. So let me address that a little bit. So as someone who's been studying public opinion for 30 years in the US about the Arab-Israeli issue, there really kind of something that didn't change, which is like 2/3 of Americans don't want the US to take sides. They actually want the US to be neutral. But there has been a shift in the following way. It used to be that Democrats and Republicans were closer to each other on this, not always identical, but closer to each other. But in the past 10 years, what we've seen is a majority of Republicans no longer want the US to be neutral. They want the US to take Israel's side decidedly, mostly because of the evangelicals. And on the Democratic side, there's been a big shift. And that big shift is not only that more and more want the US to be neutral, almost 90% in some of the polls, certainly over 80%. But of those minority who want the US to take sides, they now slightly lean more toward the Palestinians than to the Israelis. It used to be that the minority of Democrats who wanted the US to take side, and it was a larger minority than it is now, overwhelmingly wanted the US to take Israel's side, to lean toward Israel more than the Palestinians. This has shifted, and it has shifted principally because of demographics within the Democratic Party, but also because of two things. That you had a right-wing government in Israel that has been at odds with Democratic administrations, including the Obama administration, and then it became an ally of Trump, which is a central prism through which many Democrats evaluate foreign policy and domestic politics. And on that shift that has occurred within the Democratic Party beyond this leaning toward one or the other, when you look at the issues, it's really, really interesting. And it reveals something that we are beginning to understand. I started reflecting on it 4 or 5 years ago. I think Martin remembers. In fact, it was a Brookings Institution poll that I released in 2013, 2014, showing not only that this trend was happening within the Democratic Party, but that I concluded, and I wrote a piece in the Washington Post at the time, that indicated a big gap emerging between the Democratic rank and file and elected officials in Congress, where there's this big gap. And that gap, of course, shows itself on issues like most Democrats are open to sanctions, or even more than sanctions, tied to the settlement issue. Democrats are really not as opposed to BDS even as the rest of the population. And in the most recent poll that I have shown, I've showed that Democrats, Republicans, and Independents think that their elected officials in Congress across the divide are more leaning toward Israel than they are. So there is a gap, and we have begun seeing that this gap is a bit narrowing within the Democratic Party. We saw it obviously with the rise of Bernie Sanders, and we saw it with the rise of a new wave of Democrats in Congress, including in the recent elections. What was notable about it is not just that their position favoring Palestinian rights essentially didn't hurt them, it actually helped them. There's indication it actually helped them because that's where the grassroots politics are. And to my view, it's part of Democrats are not anti-Israel. There's no indication Democrats are anti-Israel or not pro-Palestinians because of Palestinians. They are essentially acting in a frame of reference of values about democracy, human rights, international law. And the Palestine question has become a prototype increasingly within the Democratic Party debate. And for that reason, I think that no matter what happens on the two-state solution, that issue is going to be critical, because one of the questions that we ask, which is, what if there's no two-state solution? Would you support Israel as a Jewish state, even if Palestinians don't get full rights? Or would you support a democratic state, even if Israel ceases to be a Jewish state? And the majority of people, including now a majority of Republicans, say they prefer a democratic Israel, even if it ceases to be Jewish. That's really a choice, obviously, that is going to become much more pressing. It's also one that has made it hard for American politicians to take a position, because no one wants to say I'm against the Jewish state. No one wants to say I'm against the democratic state. It framed the Democratic opposition to annexation, because if annexation takes place, they're forced to make that choice. They don't want to make that choice. And in my humble opinion, it was the universal Democratic Party in Congress and the Democratic candidates for president, their opposition to annexation that stopped Netanyahu from carrying it out, much more than the deal between the UAE and Israel.
Thanks, Shibli. Noor, I want to come to you. I want to give you an opportunity to respond to many of the things that we said, that we heard from Shibli and Martin, and I'm particularly interested in your take on whether or not the Palestinians have anything to gain from engaging or not engaging with a second Trump term. But I want to ask you more specifically about the point that you raised in terms of putting the Palestinian house in order and completely overhauling, I think is the word that you used, how Palestinians approach not just this issue, but even their own politics. What does that look like? But more specifically, does it entail, for example, abandoning the two-state solution? I'm sure you're familiar with the polling. Polls nowadays pretty much show either equal pluralities who support one state and support two-state, or perhaps even a slight edge for those who support a one-state solution with equal rights for all. So my question is, especially in a second Trump term, but perhaps even under a Biden administration, if two states no longer seems viable, is one state a credible option? And if so, why haven't we seen any sort of mobilization? Where is this plurality that is reflected in Palestinian public opinion in the occupied territories? Why is that not represented on the streets? We don't see a mass mobilization in favor of one state. We've yet to see any major political party or figure emerge that is kind of carrying the banner of one state. Why haven't we seen that?
Well, let me just remind that the one-state platform was the PLO platform, and it was the international community, especially successive U.S. administrations, that told the PLO, this is entirely unacceptable, nobody will support you if you advocate for one state for all its citizens. So the one-state platform, the one-state idea is not a new concept in Palestinian discourse. But I think right now, at this point, the discussion should be about self-determination. How Palestinians exercise that self-determination will be determined in due course. At this moment, I think the priority is sumud, is perseverance, is for us to survive what Trump has done, God forbid 4 more years of Trump, and even 4 years of do nothing with Biden, because Biden will be busy, and Biden's policies, as he's spoken about them, as they're written on his campaign's website, is basically a return to the status quo ante. He's very comfortable being where he was. Well, we've moved on as Palestinians. The conversation in Palestine has completely shifted, not shifted away from 2 states. It has shifted away from the obsession with the process, with sitting on that damn table that no longer exists. We're dealing with an Israeli public that overwhelmingly supports annexation, that overwhelmingly votes further and further to the right. A public that will now vote more for the extreme right. I mean, Netanyahu is not even right enough at this point, according to the latest polls. So talking about a 2-state solution, even if the majority of Palestinians supported it, is a bit farcical, I think, in my opinion, given the fact that the Israelis are not just anti-2-state solution. They are anti-Palestinian, anti-negotiations, anti-everything, because they're drunk on power and they know they can get away with it. Not just with Trump. They know that even if a Democratic administration comes to power, they won't be held accountable. So sure, there will be a statement of disappointment, a statement of anger, a voicing of concern here and there, but really, the Israeli political establishment understands that the rules of the game, as the establishment in the American system wants it to remain, is that Israel will not be held accountable. Talk of sanctions, of accountability, don't apply to Israel. And I think that's where the Palestinian focus needs to be. Because as Shibli said, the shift has been happening for some years. We do have allies in the Democratic Party, in the base of the Democratic Party, and that alliance is not based on pity, it's not based on sympathy, it's based on solidarity and common values, a common understanding that human rights are indivisible, that you can't be pro-human rights in the United States and in Africa and in Europe and in Asia and be silent on Palestine. It just doesn't work that way. That hypocrisy is being challenged at the base in the Democratic Party. And I think strategically, this is where Palestinian energies need to focus. This is where our allies truly are. This is a long haul view, if you will, of where Palestinians can go. But at this point, I think it would be a waste of time for the Palestinian political establishment to debate 1 state or 2 states. That's not where we are right now. We are in survival mode. And we are in a place where we need to re-establish our social contract, our political contract as a polity. Okay, how does this governing happen? Do we want to keep the PA or do we want to do away with the PA? Why should we carry this dead weight of the Oslo agreements and all their obligations when Israel hasn't been honoring these obligations for a long time? I think that's the conversation we need to have. And we need to have it not just in occupied Palestine. We need to have it across the diaspora, wherever Palestinians are, and a very cross-the-board conversation that we haven't had in a long time. And in that sense, I think that conversation would change the rules automatically. by focusing on the main priorities, on self-determination. Whether we determine it to be in a one state or two state, that's up to the Palestinian people. And it all depends on where Israel is. I mean, right now, I don't want to be an Israeli citizen, quite frankly, with nation state law and over 50 racist laws. That's not a battle I want to wage at this point. I don't want to be a walking target for Israeli police. I'm already a walking target here, so I might as well fight for independence. So, you know, this is I think the change that a Biden administration, if it comes along, needs to be aware of. If we have 4 more years of Trump, I think it would be folly for Abu Mazen or any Palestinian leader in his place to consider talking with Trump. Because the problem with this plan is not just that it accepts annexation. It's not just that it forgoes discussion about Jerusalem. It is that it basically wants Palestinians to adopt the Zionist narrative, to abandon theirs, to accept that they are at the losing end. And just like in the Dark Ages, whoever loses will have to surrender to the terms of the victors. That's a very important element of what the Trump plan is, and it cannot be acceptable to any Palestinian leader. It will be extremely politically costly for any Palestinian leader to engage in discussions based on that plan, or to even think, given what we've seen in the past 2 months, that the UAE, for example, is going to abandon investing in improving the checkpoints that govern the day-to-day reality of occupation, and rather talk about ending occupation. The reality has just shifted, and so we need to change the conversation as well.
Thanks, Noor. Martin, I noticed at one point you were kind of shaking your head. I want to give you a chance to respond if in fact you have something to respond to. But maybe if not, I'll tack on my own question, which is this point that Noor raised about accountability. Should either under a Biden administration or a Trump administration, should there be some way, should Israel pay a cost for maintaining the status quo, much less violating Palestinian rights?
So first of all, I listened carefully to what Noor had to say, and I think it's important to hear, and I myself haven't heard it since the normalization has gone on. And so I think that's it's a valuable contribution to the conversation to hear her express this approach in such an articulate way. I was objecting to her description of what is happening in Israel simply because it's important to look at the realities that have occurred there. There have been 3 elections in Israel in the last year. On none of those occasions, in 3 elections, was the right-wing religious bloc able to secure a majority. In 3 elections. And yes, I know the polls now suggest something different, and maybe they will succeed, but that's by no means certain. And the fact that they were not able to succeed in forming a right-wing religious government is, I think, an indicator that one of her premises, that Israel is moving, dramatically to the right. It's true, Israel's been moving to the right for the last 30 years, but there still isn't a majority now, and there was 2 years ago. So I don't think you should look at the Israeli polity when you make calculations about how to influence. And after all, they are the ones that hold the cards to Palestinian future. If self-determination is to be the focus, which I think makes sense, then it needs, I don't think it's useful to characterize the Israeli public as kind of only going in one direction and not possible to bring them back. And in that regard, I personally have always thought that the anti-normalization campaign was fundamentally flawed in the way that it cut relations between Palestinians and Israelis. And I really hope that that is part of the reassessment, that when it comes to engaging or not engaging with Israelis, the public, not the government, that see that it was a mistake not to engage with them and to take that up again, especially because Israeli Palestinians now have such a critical role to play within the Israeli polity. And they are moving into the mainstream there in a way that can benefit the Palestinian cause. But it needs to be seen as something where you can actually affect Israeli public opinion by engaging with the Israeli public rather than throwing up your hands and saying it's all hopeless, because I don't believe that's the case.
Thanks, Martin.
I just wanted to clarify something, Khaled.
Okay, I'm going to give you a chance, but I just want to let everyone know we have about 3 minutes left, and I want to give a chance for Shibli and also you, Noor, to have your final word. So go ahead, Noor, and then we'll hear from Shibli.
I just wanted to clarify, first of all, that I wasn't talking about the religious right. The shift towards the right, towards the anti-Palestinian state camp has been happening, and it's now become mainstream. And let's just remind that Blue and White also ran on a annexation platform of some kind as well. So that's important to keep in mind. The Palestinian-Israeli contact has never stopped, not just between Palestinians and Israeli soldiers, because that's our reality, but between Palestinians and Israelis who are as fed up of the status quo as we are. That hasn't stopped, and I don't think that it can. These are the partners who feel the brunt of the Israeli occupation, just as other peace activists do. Having said that, I think ultimately, with the rise of right-wing sentiments and the kind of encouragement the Trump administration has given the Netanyahus and Orbans and so on of the world, and the Modis and etc., it's going to be extremely difficult to see a proper political process forward unless there is a shift in how the politicians are dealt with. And I will go back, I will conclude with the issue of accountability. If Netanyahu doesn't know that there's a stick at the end of that conversation, he will just keep grabbing land and committing crimes and oppressing Palestinians, knowing there is no price to pay. And the Israelis will continue to pay the price at the end.
Thanks, Noor. We're just about out of time. Shibli, I want to give you a chance to wrap up the conversation and make any concluding points.
Let me just conclude by complicating things even more. And that is that, as we're all thinking, oh, we got to reassess, everybody has to reassess, that the choice isn't just between one state and two states, one state with equal citizenship and two states. Because the reality of it is, you can imagine easily that a right-wing Israeli government with a lack of outside intervention of any kind that is likely in the foreseeable future can maintain the status quo even without two states being a possibility where there's inequality. One can easily imagine that. And second, one can even imagine worse, that if there's an escalation between Israel and Palestinians, that there would be a huge move within Israel to expel Palestinians, as we have seen already in public opinion polls. One Pew poll showed that nearly half of Israelis support that possibility. So that is, of course, what the moral question for all of us about how do we, what path do we want to protect as we move forward. It isn't as straightforward as it looks like, two states versus one state. And that's actually one reason why a lot of people have stuck with a two-state solution, even though they think deep down in their heart it's not possible. Because in fact, when I polled people in the region broadly about what would happen if there's no two states, most people said either there would be a continuation of the status quo, or there would be conflict for years to come rather than one state. So I think that's something that we have to enter into the mix of the conversation, and that makes it even harder to address.
Thank you, Shibli, and thank you, Noor and Martin. I'm afraid we are out of time. I feel like we could have gone probably at least another hour, but thank you for a really fascinating and incisive discussion that we've really just kind of scratched the surface. And thank you all to our audience for participating, and a reminder that a recording of this session will be up on our website immediately afterwards. Once again, please join me in thanking all of our panelists. Thank you.
Thank you.